Hi everyone. So before we start today's show, I have two announcements to make. The first of it is that we finally have a bit of merchandise coming out, funnily enough. It's a t-shirt, it's the Return to the Source shirt. It comes in two colours, red and purple, and you can find it on our new storefront, which there's a link to down below. Pre-orders are up right now. We're really just testing the ground to see how this all goes and see how interested you guys are. So if you are, links down there. There'll also be a card somewhere up here, one of the corners. And yeah, just go check it out if you're interested in it. Give it a buy. Then you can tell all your friends that they need to return to the source to find all of their factual information. Anyway, that's the first announcement I wanted to say. The second one is more about the premise of this video. So, Source Gaming is a collective, a team effort. But that also means a few of us all have our own individual projects that allow us to express how we all sort of feel, whether that's making music, games, art. You know, we have our own things as well, and you should definitely check them out by following us all on Twitter as individuals, not just the Source Gaming Collective. But what this all leads up into is that this now is like a pilot for my own project, the Nintendo Chronicler, because anyone's out there making retrospectives of Donkey Kong Country and Super Mario 64, and they're good videos, but who's talking about Marvelous, Mole Mania, Suti Hakon, and Famicom Detective Club? Like, I don't feel like Nintendo's 200 plus IP catalogue is very well documented, and so I wanted to make a channel that was dedicated just to doing that, and maybe talking about some other ideas around Nintendo as a concept and just some fun thought things. So this is just a pilot, and if you really like it, and I hope you do, there is going to be a link to the actual new channel down in the description and a link at the end of this video. So I would encourage you, I would hope that you enjoy this and that you go subscribe to that channel. So no pressure, of course. I'm not going to force you to subscribe to anything you don't like. But if you're still unsure, go check that channel because there should be another video there as well. That will give you another idea, you know, It's the same sort of video, it's about a different topic, but let's not waste any time now. Let's get on with the show. Nintendo is known for a lot of IP, and so it's only natural that some of them will always fall by the wayside. These franchises end up dormant, and for some fans, they might just declare them outright dead because they haven't appeared in a while. But what does being dead mean in this situation? Let's take Balloon Fight as an example. It was developed by the late President Satoru Iwata, and the last game it had was in 1990, with Balloon Kid on the Game Boy. Technically, you could say the year 2000 with Balloon Kid Deluxe, the Japan-only Game Boy Color version, but it's pretty much just an enhanced port of the original. Point is, it hasn't had a new game in over 2 decades, but I would reckon that most of you watching know what Balloon Fight is. And if recognition is the lifeblood of a game, doesn't that mean that that knowledge is important? Part of this is due to how easy it is to access. Super Smash Bros. Is very generous in this regard, giving Balloon Fight an entire stage, music, and references galore. But the game can also be played on Nintendo Switch Online. Balloon Fight Versus, the arcade version, was released on Nintendo Switch in 2019, and the game was a part of the NES Remix series. It was even one of the 12 attractions with Nintendo Land, alongside big hitters like Donkey Kong and Animal Crossing and Mario. This is all to say that Balloon Fight not having had a new game doesn't mean that it's valueless. In fact, if the right idea came along and the right opportunity, then I could totally see Nintendo bringing Balloon Fight back. It's just that it's not as prominent as games like Mario and Zelda and even Pikmin and Star Fox. Fans can probably guess some of the other games that fall into this category. You've got Mac Rider, Clu Clu Land, Ice Climber. All of these series haven't had new games in a long time, but they are all arguably still recognisable. And if you were a gamer living in Japan, or just someone who knows about Nintendo's Japanese history, then there's probably a few more that you could add to that list. And I feel like one of the most prevalent of these is Nintendo's take on the Japanese adventure genre, something that's become a lot bigger nowadays thanks to visual novels. And that game is Famicom Detective Club. So in order to get to the bottom of this, let me take up the role of detective. And let's find out why a game pushed by one of the biggest names at the company, from one of the biggest gaming companies in the world, could seemingly be dead for over 2 decades, if it's really dead at all. Got my magnifying glass at the ready? Let's do some investigating. While Nintendo has been around for a very long time, they only became really known for gaming after the breakout hit that was Donkey Kong. But I would argue that they didn't become the household name we know them as today until they gave consumers the option to bring their games to the household, with the Family Computer System in 1983, or Famicom for short. The Famicom was a novelty, and as the years went on, Nintendo built up a portfolio of games encompassing a plethora of different genres. Platformers, arcade-like, sports, education, racing, action, sandbox, shooter, fighting, and even creation games. Nintendo were dipping their toes into every genre pool, so it was only a matter of time before they turned their attention to the growing adventure game genre found on Japanese PCs at the time. In the West, Sierra had pioneered adventure games that used graphics as well as text to sell interactive and narratively driven tales. In Japan, it was all porn. Games like Danchizuma no Yuwaka by Koei or Seduction of the Condominium Wives, a game about selling condoms, were somewhat popular on Japanese PCs at the time. But it wouldn't always be this way, and the shift began in 1983 with the Portopopia serial murder case by Chunsoft and Enix. Originally on the NEC PC 6001, yep, PC names in this time are weird, it was a first-person detective title where the player took the role of an unnamed boss and had to solve the murder of a Japanese banker. Touted by Enix as the first real detective adventure game, it was very impressive for its time with lots of non-linear elements and branching dialogue choices. Though I suppose we shouldn't expect anything less than impressive from its designer Yuji Horii, the man who would go on to make the first Dragon Quest game on the Famicom 3 years later. The reason this game is significant to today's case is that it would be ported to the Famicom in 1985. This version would replace the keyboard inputs with predetermined commands and a point-and-click style of investigation, and this title would end up in the hands of a man not too familiar with gaming called Yoshio Sakamoto. Sakamoto was primarily a graphic designer at the time, working on the Game & Watch titles under the system's creator Gunpei Yokoi. He would also work on the graphics for our favourite not dead game, Balloon Fight. But after getting the chance to design his own games like Wrecking Crew, Gumshoe and Metroid, Sakamoto began learning by playing other people's games. One of them was the Portopopia serial murder case, and it left a big impact on him. It made him realise that games are capable of many things. It inspired him to make a game in this same genre. He must have had that desire written all over his face, because as soon as he was finished helping get Kid Icarus out to market, he was approached by Yokoi with a proposition. Sakamoto-san, we need a game called Famicom Shonen Tantaiden. Now get to work. Famicom Shonen Tantaiden, or Famicom Youth Detective Club, is the game that would eventually become today's focus. But there were some oddities about this approach. For one, the name was all Sakamoto was given, and he had the freedom to do whatever he wanted with that. He could have made it a platformer or a Pac-Man clone if he wanted. I don't know how that would have worked, but he could have done it. Iwata would later go on to describe this approach to game design as very old school, and it's definitely very different to Nintendo's famous gameplay-driven approach that they have today. The other oddity was that Nintendo weren't going to be the developers. Yokoi had actually brought on a third-party company to assist with development. We don't actually know who they were, but we do know things didn't quite pan out. Sakamoto was having a lot of problems with this game's development at the start because, despite the name, the company that was helping out didn't plan for a game that focused on a story. That was a bit of an issue. Sakamoto was dead set on this idea. He wanted to make a game like Portopia, something with a tight story that would surprise players and take them through highs and lows of joy and sorrow, and so went to his superiors with a request that he could write the scenario for this game and take it in a more story-driven direction. And despite his lack of experience in this field, Nintendo said yes. He got the go-ahead, and the company who he was working with gave him an initial theme to start with. The boy with no memory is actually... This was the core theme of the story, and from this, Sakamoto essentially handwrote the entire plot and handed it to his team as if it was some kind of novel. While Portopia would inspire the gameplay, the story was actually a homage to giallo movies of Italian horror filmmaker Dario Argento. He felt that Argento's work captured the four key elements in story making: mood, pause, foreshadowing, and contrast. He wanted to make sure Famicom Detective Club also captured this. Sakamoto also didn't pay much attention to actual detective novels, with the exception of Inugamaki no Ichizoku and Akuma no Tamari Uta, both by Seisha Yokomizu. So what did Sakamoto come up with based on his limited experience and the little bit of nuggets he was given from his peers? Now, I'm not going to spoil the story for you. Obviously, the remakes are about to come out. And while I personally don't think that the basic premise of a story is a spoiler, just in case you do want to go in completely blind, jump to the timestamp listed here. You can just skip the whole story plot for the first game. You might think that the Famicom Detective Club games star this girl here, Ayumi Tachibana. After all, she is the one who has the biggest presence in other media, even having an entire page dedicated to her on Nintendo's Japanese website. But it's actually Protagonist Kun here who is our main character, and the story begins when he wakes up with amnesia on a beach in a coastal town in Japan. Protag Kun is rescued by a man named Amachi, and shortly after meets up with Ayumi, who tells him that he is an assistant detective, investigating the death of Kiku Ayashiro of the Ayashiro estate in Myojin village. So Protag Kun and Ayumi, who also works as an assistant detective at the Utsugi Detective Agency, have to investigate the murder and its connections to a series of murders and their relation to a long-held superstition in the town. Protag Kun is alright as a protagonist here. He's the window by which the player views the world, and you can even name him yourself. But I wouldn't say he was the most memorable of characters. That's probably to do with the fact that the game was in first person, so you never really saw his face. But it also might have to do with Ayumi, a character who gets a lot of screen time and characterization over the course of the two games. It makes her feel like the real star of the show. The sequel will do a lot more to characterize them both, but for now, they are both a pair of perfectly passable protagonists for the time. And overall, that story was received really well. It impressed the higher-ups at Nintendo, so much so that they removed Sakamoto from the project. Talk about sending mixed messages. Well, okay, I am being a tad dramatic. The actual order of events aren't super clear, but during the development of Famicom Detective Club, Sakamoto was pulled away for a 2-week period to become the scenario writer for another adventure game that would end up releasing first, Nakayama Miho no Tokimeki High School, the first dating simulator that Nintendo would have a hand in. It was a joint collaboration between Nintendo and Squaresoft, with Sakamoto penning the story and directing, while the game was designed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, who was pulling double duty with both this game and a little known game called Final Fantasy. What is it with these kings of RPGs showing up in the adventure game scene? Development was a tad hectic, partly due to Sakamoto's decision to have the lead girl be a real-life idol, Nakayama Miho, and this influenced how he would approach the development of Famicom Detective Club. For starters, the outside company was now out, and Nintendo R&D 1 would be the main developers, specifically a little group called Team Shikamaru. It was comprised of Sakamoto himself, Toru Osawa, the creator of Kid Icarus and a scenario director for Ocarina of Time, and Makoto Kano, the concept designer of Metroid, Kid Icarus and Famicom Wars. Osawa would pen the actual script based on Sakamoto's original scenario, while Sakamoto himself would focus on directing, with Kano supervising the whole project and likely playing a part in how the game looked. It was like they had their own little detective club, game dev club. The first Famicom Detective Club game, The Missing Heir, would release for the Famicom Disk System on April 27, 1988. It was actually released across 2 separate discs, with Volume 2 releasing June 14, 1988. Think of it like episodes, like what Telltale Games would popularise for a time about 2 decades later. Unlike most games of this era, we actually do have contemporary reviews recorded, and well, that was a big surprise, let me tell you. Famitsu gave the game a 29 out of 40, and this was back when Famitsu scores actually mattered. And the readers of Famimaga gave the game a 19.30 out of 25. Later, and retrospective reviewers would go on to call this game a masterpiece of adventure titles. But for Sakamoto, the most important review actually came from a fan who sent the whole development team Valentine's Day chocolates on Valentine's Day and a letter thanking them for making the game. It was this incident that made Sakamoto realise how much of an impact video games can have on people, and he considers it a major turning point in his career. After the success of the first game, it was time for Part 2, The Girl Who Stands Behind, a murder mystery that this time was set in a Japanese high school. The same team worked on this title, although Osawa would actually take a much bigger role, with some sources claiming he was the director. Sakamoto was once again the scenario writer. The story was inspired by Argento's 1975 classic Deep Red, Sakamoto's favourite movie. It was also inspired by Japanese ghost stories, and was considered a pioneer of that genre by some reviewers. Alright, so once again, I'm going to give a quick rundown of the story and characters, and just like before, it'll be a basic premise, but if you don't want to be spoilt, timestamp here, skip that over, come back afterwards. That being said, there is one little fact that might be worth knowing beforehand, and that's the fact that this game in particular is a prequel to the other one. So if you want to play the games in chronological order, it's probably good to know that so you can start with this one, but that's entirely up to you. Alright, spoiler time. This game does a lot to flesh out the characters of Protag Kun and Ayumi, as well as the people in their lives. For starters, Utsugi actually appears this time, and we get to see how he became the guardian of Protag Kun, something stated in the first game but not shown until now. This story also shows how Protag Kun and Ayumi actually meet. The victim of this game, Yoko, was a friend of Ayumi's, and together they both formed the titular detective club at their high school. So Ayumi is determined to investigate her friend's death, and will do whatever is necessary to find the truth. At the same time, Protag Kun is tasked with collecting evidence at the high school because he's 15 himself, so he has an easier time investigating. He's also not got amnesia this time, meaning we as players can actually see what he's really like, and he has a lot more edge on him in this game than the first. The game starts with him running from the police, and throughout the adventure he will grill potential witnesses and even break into the school after hours to investigate. He has a good heart, but he also wants to prove himself, much like Ayumi. Famicom Detective Club Part 2 would release 1 year after the first, on May 23rd, 1989, with Volume 2 coming out on the 30th of June, 1 month later. Reception for this title was pretty much on par with the first, with Famitsu giving the game a 28 out of 40. However, the general consensus from fans is that this is the better game, with the readers of Famimaga giving it a 20.90 out of 25. Players fell in love with the character of Ayumi Tachibana, and many cited that the school setting, being so familiar to people in Japan, added a layer of unease and fear over the whole situation. This game is the one that most fans remember, and the depiction of Ayumi in this title is always the one that gets referenced, to the point that it wasn't until the remakes that we even got artwork of her in anything other than her Part 2 outfit, at least outside the messy box arts. It's the fan favourite one, and we will see this story again very soon. But how actually are these games from a game POV? I've talked a lot about the development and the stories than the actual gameplay, and this is for good reason. The appeal is mostly the story, and the gameplay is pretty straightforward. It's what you would expect from an adventure game, something along the lines of Ace Attorney or Zero Escape. It feels more like them than, say, Fate or other visual novels. Because it's not a visual novel, it's an adventure game, and as such it has a lot more interactivity involved. You'll spend all of your time looking at a screen like this, with all the actions in the top left and the commands in the top right, while text appears at the bottom. You can really see the influence Sakamoto took when you compare it to Portopopia. And your commands are pretty much what you'd expect. You can pick who to talk to and what you would talk about. You can investigate your surroundings by choosing to check and click on objects in the action screen. That includes people, so giving Ayumi a little bop on the nose is perfectly doable if you're so inclined. Just don't expect her to not be embarrassed by it. If there is something you can take or open, then the option for that appears, and if you're stuck, just give it some thought and Protag might direct the player on what option they should be doing next. These commands basically control everything in the game, and to progress it's all about grilling people for as much information as possible and investigating the area. If you find the right evidence, a new option should open up, either a location to visit or dialogue to start. It's an investigation story, held up by its story and character interactions. These are what push the player forward. Of course, being on the Famicom, disk system or not, means there will be some limitations, especially in the presentation department. The visuals don't get much more dynamic than an environment and a person standing in that environment. Luckily for this series, however, it wouldn't be long until Nintendo released a much stronger system, one that could bring a new level of fidelity to these titles. And well, eventually we would get that. The Super Nintendo would launch in Japan in 1990, but at this time the devs behind the series were a little preoccupied. Team Shikamaru was moved on to the Game Boy, where they worked on games like Balloon Kid and Karo no Tame ni Kane wa Naru. Most notably though, during this time, Team Shikamaru would work on what some might say is their magnum opus, Tolero Boxer, the classic Virtual Boy exclusive. Oh, and also Super Metroid, I guess. All this being said, we know Nintendo R&D1 were the lead developers once more for the third game in this series. It's likely that Team Shikamaru worked on it as well and were simply uncredited. That's a pretty easy thing to happen in this instance, as the third Famicom Detective Club game was released exclusively for the Satelliview, Nintendo's online streaming service. The Satelliview was a Japan-exclusive service with some notable games, like an Excitebike title with Mario characters and a full remake of The Legend of Zelda in 16-bit. What made the Satelliview really appealing, however, was that it allowed Nintendo to stream audio tracks simultaneously with the footage, audio that didn't need to be produced by the hardware. This meant that games could be fully voice acted, something very appealing for a game with such a heavy emphasis on its story. That seems like the most likely reason the game was on this system, as the new Detective Club game wasn't the only narrative game being worked on for the Satelliview. Shin Onigashima, an earlier adventure game, saw spin-offs on the platform by Nintendo's dedicated satellite broadcasting division. It's also possible that they worked on this new game as well. BS Tantai Club Yuki ni Kitakaku, or BS Famicom Detective Club Lost Memories in the Snow, was broadcast in early 1997 across 3 chapters, the first from February 9th to 15th, the second from the 16th to the 22nd, and the last from the 23rd to March 1st. The game's main focus was all around the series' heroine Ayumi, voiced by Yuku Minaguchi, who most people might know as Videl from Dragon Ball Z. Just as an aside, she also came back to voice Ayumi for the new remakes, and Protag is also being voiced for the first time here. His voice actor is Megumi Ogata, who you might know best as Yugi Moto from Yu-Gi-Oh!
So we have both Videl and Yugi solving crimes together. What an odd image. Alongside voice acting, the Detecitve game also had a new system where players can review the characters they've met on a family tree. The focus of this game, was fleshing out Ayumi's character and backstory. Not only was she the player character this time, but most of the cast are her family members or the members of a rival family with whom they don't get along. The setting is also the Japanese countryside where Ayumi's family is from. Whether the game is a sequel to the first or takes place between the two, it is hard to say. Ayumi is 17 again, so it's pretty close either way.
It's a real shame that they aren't remaking this game with the other two, as there's no real way to play it anymore in its intended format. I mean, there are ways to play it, but not without the vocal audio track, which just doesn't give you the full experience.
The only way that can be heard is through the very blurry recordings floating around online, which is where this footage comes from. This game most likely did well, seeing how, seemingly just after it finished airing, Team Shikamaru got to work on a fourth installment. This time around, they wouldn't be making a new story. Instead, the focus was to take the fan favourite second game in the series, The Girl Who Stands Behind, and remake it with better graphics and sound. That seemed to be the driving motivation, as the team hoped that it would make the experience feel fresh and leave some long-lasting memories in its player base. It's also worth noting that the graphics and sound teams are the first ones credited in this game, so that shows how important they were. And this credit is well deserved. The graphical glow-up is the clear standout of this game, taking that tiny action window and building it out into sections with full cutscenes, CGs and animations. The other new feature included was the review option, allowing Protag-kun to look at notes about the case and each of the characters involved, the next logical step from the Detective's family tree option. The game would release in 1998 as a part of the Nintendo Power Service, a new initiative Nintendo was doing where players could download games for cheap onto a blank cartridge. Nintendo wasn't really in the business of dedicating a lot of cartridge love to the SNES at this point. It would have to be a rare case like Fire Emblem or Wrecking Crew. And adventure games were also being heavily pushed on this service as well, with Shin Onigashima and a new IP in Hajime no Mori. This game was hugely popular. Nintendo Online Magazine reported that The Girl Who Stands Behind was the 7th most popular Super Famicom game out of the 163 available for the Nintendo Power Service. It being the most recent also meant that games like Super Smash Bros. Melee and Super Mario Maker would base their designs for Ayumi from this title. For Westerners, it is also the most well-known game in the series, as this was the only one that got a fan translation online, the only real entry point for most players. And then that was it.
So what happened here? How did this title go from being somewhat key on the Famicom disk system to being relegated to add-ons for the Super Nintendo and then just axed entirely? Well, it seems to come down to how Nintendo themselves began to perceive the Japanese adventure genre.
It seems that during the SNES era, Nintendo didn't feel massively confident in games from this genre standing out as full-blown releases. There was a market for them in Japan, but it was on a small scale. With the turn of the millennia, the all-new GameCube and Game Boy Advance went without a single new adventure game from Nintendo's offices. Traditional JRPGs, which had gotten a massive boost thanks to series like Pokemon and Final Fantasy, were the new in. They could have that narrative strength and more active gameplay on top. Nintendo did help Capcom launch the Ace Attorney series during this time, so it's also possible that Nintendo didn't see a need for them to make their own game in the genre. But perhaps most damning to the franchise's potential was the disillusion of Team Shikamaru. The Famicom Detective Club remake was really their swan song. Gunpei Yokoi, the series' original producer, had left Nintendo before that game released, and as soon as this remake came out, Makoto Kano would pack up his bags and leave as well. While Sakamoto and Osawa would both remain, both were destined for different projects. As mentioned earlier, Osawa would go on to work on Ocarina of Time, and from there would be put in front of a number of more unusual games, like the e-reader Mario Party minigames on the Game Boy Advance. Sakamoto, on the other hand, would double down on the Metroid series during this time, with Fusion and Zero Mission, as well as taking over the Wario franchise after the success of the first WarioWare game. his attention would be split between multiple high-profile franchises, leaving the poor Detective Club to remain empty and full of cobwebs. Nintendo would still let the public in from time to time, however, with re-releases. The first came in 2004, with both of the original Famicom games being released on the Game Boy Advance under the Famicom miniseries. These are the versions I own. Region free, baby. And these ports did remarkably well, with both games getting into Japan's top 10 sales ranking during their launch weeks. The Missing Heir and The Girl Who Stands Behind were both released on the Wii Virtual Console in Japan, with the remake of the latter game being released slightly later. Then the same thing happened again on the 3DS Virtual Console, with the remake being exclusive to the new 3DS. On the Wii U, Nintendo chose not to even bother with the Famicom version of Part 2, instead just releasing its SNES remake and then The Missing Heir. So Nintendo was still pushing the series as a part of its back catalogue, but that was unfortunately it for the franchise. Outside of this and the earlier mentioned cameos in Super Smash Bros. Melee and Mario Maker, the only time the series would appear is Super Smash Bros. Ultimate with an Ayumi Spirit Battle, taking art from the original Famicom release instead of the SNES game. Ayumi was considered as a fighter for Melee at one point, but her lack of Western recognition and the fact that having her fighting wouldn't really be in character ended up putting Melee director Masahiro Sakurai off.
So what is my conclusion here? After examining all the facts on why this series died, it seems that the reason was because Sakamoto, the creator, just couldn't give it the attention that it deserved. His attention was taken and placed elsewhere on other projects. And so, like a neglected child, Famicom Detective Club just sat there, getting acknowledgement here and there from Nintendo, but nothing major. But that's also why that we can thank Sakamoto for why this series is getting a reawakening in the modern era.
In the September 2019 Nintendo Direct presentation, while fans were getting hyped for the soon-to-be-released Banjo & Kazooie and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, Nintendo completely blindsided everyone by announcing a full remake of the first two Detective Club games for Nintendo Switch. In the Japanese version of the Direct, Sakamoto appeared, introducing the original games and then revealing them again with brand new graphics, UI and sound. Gone was the little box in the left corner. Now players had the full screen to play with, and the very basic animations were replaced with a kind of 2D live visual style. The game features new graphics, music, and voice acting, with Yuku Minaguchi returning after 22 years to voice Ayumi. It is a full remake, one that is aiming to be both a modern adventure game while not damaging the taste of the original. Nintendo isn't developing the game internally this time. They've got too much on their plate with all this Mario and Animal Crossing to manage. Instead, the Japanese visual novel experts at Majors would be developing the title, while staff from the original oversee development, presumably Sakamoto and Osawa. Majors has worked on a lot of visual novels over their career, most notably the Science Adventure series and its magnum opus, that one anime that you probably didn't realise was a game until after you watched it. This is their first time working with Nintendo, and if the games do well, maybe they'll get to work on a remake of the third game, or something entirely original in the future.
And there is a chance that it will. Famicom Detective Club, being announced in a Japanese-only Nintendo Direct, didn't give its Western fans, me, much hope that it was ever going to be localised, but thankfully, this story has a happy ending.
There was much radio silence throughout 2020 as Famicom Detective Club missed its projected release date and nothing of the title was shown off. It just remained listed on Nintendo's list of upcoming games alongside Bayonetta 3 and Metroid Prime 4. And then, out of nowhere, Nintendo not only dropped a general Nintendo Direct in February 2021, but the best Nintendo Direct they've ever made, because it announced that these games were being released in the West. We were finally officially getting these stories outside of Japan. Yes, they are digital only, they only have Japanese voice acting, and they kept the word Famicom in the title for some reason, but this is the chance that the series has to succeed on a mass scale.
At the time of recording, the remakes haven't come out yet, and assuming I've kept to my schedule, this video should be out before they come out as well. If not, hello, future people. How did the games go? Were they fun? Like a lot of the early previews said they were, so I'm really hoping that the final product turns out great. I want this game to be a success story. Something like Astral Chain, as opposed to something like Sushi Strikers. I mean, it's a good game, but nobody bought it. And this moment we're in right now is going to decide the future of this franchise. For most true first-party games, the biggest hurdle to development is actually having a team to make the game. Mario, Zelda, and to a lesser extent Animal Crossing and Splatoon have dedicated teams that will always be around to make these games. And as long as Miyamoto draws breath, you know that there's going to be some kind of Star Fox or Pikmin in development. But series like F-Zero and Balloon Fight, these ones that people might think are dead but are really just floating around in the ether somewhere, missing, they need the kind of success that would justify keeping these sort of teams around. Famicom Detective Club has now got its chance to be that with Majors. And as long as it does well, Nintendo might always give it a place at the main table. So go buy it. Really, that's the whole reason I made this video. Like, you guys now have a vetted interest in this series, and so you should definitely go and buy it and support it. And then I'll finally have peers that I can talk to about it, and then I can start shilling other obscure Nintendo games like Marvelous and Sooty Hack-On, and eventually Nintendo will be forced to make new ones of them, and then all these old series I like will come back. It's the perfect crime. I'm counting on you.
Thank you everyone for watching this video, and let me know what you think of it in the comments below. Like I said, this is a pilot episode, if you will, of a new channel we're launching, the Nintendo Chronicler. A link to that should be on screen right now and down below. I want to thank all the patrons of Source Gaming, especially the $5 ups who are appearing on screen right now. Every little helps keep the website and the channel afloat. We also have the shirts, as mentioned at the start of this, and there's going to be a link to them as well down below. So now, I think what your next task should be, which should be to like, should be to go down and subscribe to the new channel, maybe check out the video that's there, and then also go to the, market page, just bring it up in an extra tab, and take a look at the shirt. If you like it, buy it, Its pre-orders are up now, and they'll ship in June, so what are you waiting for? Make sure you do that, and then remember to return to the source.